So let's take a look at section 15.4, the meaning of the passage. This might be a helpful chart for you to come back to when you're doing your translation work. I might add a few notes to what Duff has given you here. In the indicative mood, if we have a present tense passive, we're going to translate it for Luo in particular as I am being untied, you are being untied. Notice that this gets across the sense of continuity that's part of the present. But remember too, that the present doesn't have to be translated with a sense of continuity. And so we can also translate it as I am untied. That's the state I'm in the present moment. I am untied. You are untied. That's another option, just like we have two options for the active meaning, right? We could translate the active, I untie, and I am untying. Notice that in this case, the action is actually doing, sorry, the subject is actually doing the action. I untie, I am untying. But in the passive, as we talked about earlier, the action is happening to the subject. So I am untied or I am being untied. In the future, we translate that as I will be untied, you will be untied. In the imperfect, I was being untied, you were being untied. And again, with the imperfect, we have all the options that we've had from the first time we ran across the imperfect. I began being untied, I kept being untied. So those are some other options for the imperfect. In the aorist, it's just I was untied, you were untied. In the imperative, so the present emphasizes the process, be untied. And as I said in another video, you might try to communicate that process by saying be being untied. That's very awkward in English, so it's not necessary. But if you want in your exercises to communicate to me that you've noticed that it's a present imperative, or present imperative, and you want to communicate to me that you've noticed that this emphasizes the process, you can certainly put that in your homework, be being untied. In the aorist, it's just undefined, be untied. Then in the infinitive, in the present, again, emphasizing the process, to be untied. And if you want to communicate this process in English very awkwardly, it would be to be being untied. And then in the aorist, it's just to be untied. And then in the participle, we have being untied. That's simultaneous to the main verb. And so we're going to have some awkwardness with tenses, with participles, as always. But the present participle communicates that it's something that's happening at the same time as the main verb. And if you want to use an English participle, you can translate it as being untied. And then with the aorist, you want to communicate that it's something that happened before the main verb, even if it's immediately before the main verb, and we translate that as having been untied. So in 15.5, you get all of the endings. I went over the endings with you in an earlier video, so I'm not going to spend any time on that. But let's turn the page and note that in the passive and in the future and in the aorist, we're adding a theta. And just like when we added sigmas, adding a theta causes odd things to happen to the stem. So for example, we have 4 examples there. We have achthe somai, which is from ago, but when we have the gamma from ago and we add the theta, we get the key. So we get achthe somai. And then same thing with ago, now we've added an augment, and so we get an eta at the beginning instead of an alpha, and then the gamma again switches to a key, so we get ethane in the aorist passive. Laleo, verbs that have an epsilon ending, the epsilon is going to lengthen just like in front of a sigma. So instead of lalethes, we get lalethes. And then baptizomai, the zeta there, when you add a sigma, or when you add a theta, is going to turn into a sigma. So you get baptisthenai. And so now when we look at the practices, for 15.5.1 and 15.5.2. There's just 6 of them there. So let's look at them. Number 1, we have enoigeto, and that's from the verb anoigo. Recognize that the stem is einoig, and we have it here, except that we notice that the alpha has turned to an eta, and that's because an epsilon has been added. Remember, that immediately tells us that it's in the indicative mood. So now we just have to figure out the rest. And notice that there's nothing in between the stem and the ending. So that tells us that it's the imperfect. And here we have the middle passive endings. Now, notice that this is not a deponent verb. If it ended in omai in the lexical form, we would recognize it as deponent and we would put deponent here. But it's not a deponent, it's an active verb. And so we put middle passive, and that's a third person singular ending. Therapeu thesomai. We have the verb thera peu, and we have the same stem right here and no augment and this long ending. That kind of gives you a clue that it's future. So this is the indicative future. That is the passive ending. And the omai, of course, is first person singular. Baptistes, we have baptizo, and we have the zeta that turns to a sigma in front of the theta. We have no augment and a theta, so that tells us that it's not going to be indicative, and we're going to learn the endings so that we know that the ace ending is actually the participle ending. So this is a participle. It's an aorist passive participle, and this ending is nominative masculine singular. All right, give me a minute and I'll put the next 3 up. All right, these are pretty easy, but they help us to see the difference between the deponent verbs and the middle passive verbs. So notice that these, this is number 4 and number 5, they have the same endings. So let's take a look at what's going on here. The lexical form of this verb is dioko. And so we have the present stem right there. We have the middle passive endings. And so this is indicative, present, middle passive, and it's third person plural. But here, the lexical form is erkomai. And so even though we have the same thing, no augment, the present tense stem, the same ending, the way we're going to parse that is indicative present. And here we're going to put a D for deponent because this is a deponent verb. Again, we know that because in the lexical form, it ends in omai instead of omega. And of course, this is still third plural. And then here we have poieo. And we notice that the epsilon has turned to an eta in front of the theta, and that we have an epsilon augment. And so we know that this is indicative, aorist, passive, and this is the third person singular ending. All right, we will look at irregular futures and aorist passives next, just to complicate things a little bit more. Take care.